So we finished in the last video by reading the final stanza of the poem, and we talked very briefly, in no detail, but I asked you to focus on this idea of personal pronouns. So let's have a wee think about that. So I asked you to think about this question: can you notice anything interesting as we start to focus on the final stanza in regard to personal pronouns? So let's remind you of what those are. Most of you know that, and I don't want to insult your intelligence, but for those of us who maybe have forgotten what I mean by that, well, first, second, and third person pronouns are actually a way of describing different points of view. So the first person is the I, we perspective. I've put that in bold for you to make that clear. The second person is the you perspective. And the third person is the he, she, it, they perspective. Now, I don't want to labour this, so I'm going to read through this quickly, but I think it's a really interesting and valid point. I hope you noticed there that the fourth and final stanza marks a shift. So if you look back over the poem, you'll notice that the first stanza focused on the we of the regiment. We talked about this last week. The we of the regiment, all the soldiers together. Then the second stanza focused on the he of the dying soldier. Remember, our attention was drawn to the death and the he, the dying soldier. The third stanza focused on the I of the traumatized speaker, who we know to be Owen. And now, in this fourth stanza, I hope you noticed that the focus moves to the you of the reader. Isn't that very clever? So in this stanza, the speaker directly addresses the reader because he's trying to make them understand the brutal reality of war, talking now directly to the reader. And this is an effort to contradict what the speaker describes as the old lie. And what do we now know that lie is? That war and dying in war is meaningful and full of glory. And what he's trying to do here is contradict that idea. So look at how Owen uses the second person pronoun you. You can look at your poems again in the final stanza, because he wants the reader, and I'll say this first of all, he wants the reader to think and reflect on the cruel reality of war. But you'll notice I've also put in brackets here that we could additionally think about who the intended reader is here. Because remember, he's writing this around 1917, didn't he die in 1918? 1917. So primarily, who is he addressing? Is he addressing these young innocents going off to war? Is he addressing, because we know that this is targeted at Jesse Pope, pro-war poets, but he's also, this is having an impact on us in 2021, years and years later. Did he take all that into, I'm sure he's not thinking about us in 2021, but I want you to think about the implication of this and the broad audience, but also the primary audience and who that could be. So, on that note, he makes a reference to my friend in the final stanza. And I was just thinking, could the my friend reference be Jesse Pope? And it's a very tongue-in-cheek comment, because he's being quite sarcastic here. It is certainly worth thinking about. So in the final stanza, Owen describes the face of the dying soldier. He describes how the soldier's lifeless body was flung into the wagon and how he saw the white eyes of the soldier writhing in his face. He compares the soldier's face to a face of the devil who is tired of sin, and that says something, doesn't it? So Owen focuses heavily on the senses. Think of all your senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. But what senses does he focus on in particular? And why? because he's inviting the reader to share in that moment, and that's why he really focuses in on the senses. He describes the gargling of the blood from the 4th corrupted lungs, and he emphasizes how the pain undergone by the soldier is obscene as cancer. And you will notice that the final 4 lines are sarcastically composed, that means written, put together, to undermine the noble statement of patriotism, which is heralded by Jessie Pope in her poem when she purports that idea that it is honourable to die for one's own country. And what Owen does is he uses the full phrase, because we don't get the full phrase in the title, but we get the full phrase at the very end of the poem, when he ends his poem by saying, Dulce et decorum est pro patria more, which can be translated, it is sweet and proper to die for one's country. So what I want you to do, and I'm going to stop the video again,